Hello everybody. In this video we're going to take a look at some quick and easy techniques for creating landscapes in Maya. So the first thing I'm going to do is to create a polygon plane. And since this is going to be a landscape, I'm going to go ahead and make this polygon plane larger. And because I'm going to need a little bit more resolution than what we currently have at uh, 10 subdivisions on the width and 10 on the height, I'm going to increase that as well. For now, I'm going to make it 50 and 50. Now, just about all the methods I'm going to be showing you today for creating a landscape are going to have the benefit of really not uh, necessitating the need of doing any major UV work. Because we're dealing with a polygon plane here, if I go to my UV editor, you'll see that I have its default UVs already laid out. So this is going to work for what I want to do later on if I choose to also texture my landscape. So the first method I'm going to show you is very easy. I'm simply going to go to component mode and select a vertex. Now if I select a vertex, of course I can move it. However, if I go to my modeling toolkit and turn on soft select, then I'll get a fall off on my selection, and this is a very nice and easy way to create rolling hills. Now remember that if you need to change the size of the fall off for the soft select, you can do that simply by inputting a number in this field here. Currently it's set to 19.86. If I want to make it about half that, I'll say about 10. You'll see that now I have a much smaller fall off. The more intuitive way to adjust the size of your fall off for your soft select is to simply hold the B key on your keyboard and use the left mouse button. And then that way you can interactively change the size of the fall off for your soft select. And if we were to position our camera in such a way, then you can see that we could get this sense of a landscape, perhaps with some rolling hills. Now, when using this method for creating, let's say, rolling hills using the soft select, again, it's going to be really to your advantage to be able to change the size of your fall off to get different effects. And as you can see, this could be quite an effective landscape here. There are a couple other things, however, to take note of that you can also do with this soft select. Obviously, we can select more than one vertex to get some different effects. But we can also adjust the fall off of that soft select. So what you'll notice here is, for instance, if I drag this handle and I drag it in this direction, then let me make my brush a little smaller to demonstrate this. I'll get this kind of flat surface on the top. Or, for that matter, I could always do something like this as well, where I end up with this crater in the hill here. If I wish to reset the fall off for my soft select, I'll simply click on the Reset Curve button here. Another very effective tool when creating landscapes in Maya is this tool here, the Paint Selection tool. I'm going to double click on it so that not only will I activate this tool, but I will also open up its tool settings. I'm going to switch to face mode, and I will make my brush a little bigger, and I'll just start selecting some areas on my mesh here. Now that I've made my selection, I'll go ahead and activate my move tool, and I'll just translate it up. In addition, with the paint selection tool, not only can I increase my selection, I can also use this unselect button and deselect. So I'm going to deselect from my current selection here. And perhaps I'll move this up as well. In fact, I can do this a number of different times. Each pass, perhaps selecting a little bit less of the current selection. And I end up with something like this. As you can see, this can be a really great way of creating a terraced landscape. Now there are a couple other things we can still do to this landscape that I've just created. For instance, we can apply mesh smooth to it to smoothen out some of those rough edges that we have. And of course, we can still come in here and use some of those other techniques, such as selecting a vertex and turning on our soft select and fine-tuning and adjusting our landscape with that. Of course, you can use a combination of many of these techniques. So for this example, I'm going to select my paint selection tool again. Maybe I'll make my brush a little smaller by holding down the B key and the left mouse button. And I'm going to change my selection to face, and I'll go ahead and just create this selection. Right now I still have it set to unselect, so I need to check select. And I'll make this kind of meandering selection here. Maybe make it branch off like this. And then I can turn on my soft select and maybe change its effect. I'm going to manually type in the value, I think. Find a good value here. This could be good. And with soft select, then I get a softer effect when I move my selection down. as you can see, that can create an interesting landscape. Again, if I choose to add some more resolution, I can come in here and do a mesh smooth to it. This is a fine resolution here. I probably would avoid getting any higher resolution than this, however, for these landscapes. But you can see that that gives us enough resolution to get a good effect. Let's take a look at a couple other really effective tools for creating your landscapes. So for this example, I'm going to create another polygon plane, which I'll move over here. I will scale it up as well. And I will increase its subdivisions like that. And these other tools that we could use to create our landscapes can be found under Mesh Tools, Sculpting Tools. In fact, we can use any of these tools here, although the ones that I would say would be most useful for us will be the Sculpt tool and the Grab tool. I will use the Sculpt tool first, and I will open up its tool settings. Currently my brush is very large. As you can see, you can adjust the size of the brush by using this slider here. Or once again, you can of course use your B key and you can interactively change the size of your brush. You can also change the strength of your brush. Here's the effect I have now. If I increase the strength, you'll see it becomes much stronger. However, you can also adjust this strength, not just with the slider, but by holding down the M key and using your left mouse button. And you'll see there's a visual representation of how high or how strong that, that brush is. But this Sculpt tool is a really excellent tool for, once again, creating that sense of maybe some rolling hills. In addition, we can also use the Grab tool, which is found in the same place under Mesh Tools, Sculpting Tools, Grab tool. We can, of course, change the size of our brush. And then this will allow us to make big changes very quickly, simply by grabbing and dragging. Now, something really important to keep in mind when creating your landscapes is that as the artist, you have control of the camera. In other words, you control what the viewer is going to see. So what I would recommend doing when creating your landscapes is to create a camera. I'm going to name my camera Render Camera. My reason for doing this is then that I can continue using my perspective camera more as a working camera, and then the work that I put into my render camera, positioning it and getting it just right, I can then work to that camera to make my landscape look as effective as possible. I'm going to select my render camera and I'm going to look through it. I'm going to change my top view to actually look through this camera that I just created. And I'm going to start placing it for my landscape here. Now, because I'm controlling what my viewer is seeing, it doesn't matter that I've got these two different elements here to create this landscape, that it's not this one continuous mesh. And what I can do then is move around the parts of my landscape scale them up if necessary, create the effect that I want for this landscape that I'm creating. I'm going to go ahead and reposition my camera a little bit. In fact, a couple things I recommend when working specifically to a camera, in this case to my render camera, is to enable this button here, which will show us the actual borders of our composition. So I know that anything going off of this area here is not going to get rendered. This will make it easier to work to the camera. And then the other thing is I don't want to come in here and accidentally move my camera and then lose that hard work that I put into placing it. So another thing I would recommend doing is when you get that camera angle that you like, come over here in your viewport and click on this ribbon icon, which indicates a bookmark. So if I click on that then, and then accidentally move this, and then I have to move my camera back and try to get it as well as I can, as close as I can to what I had set earlier. Instead of having to do that, I can simply go to View, Bookmarks, and find my bookmark here called Camera View 1, and that will pop it right back to that original position. In fact, bookmarking these different camera positions is a great way to play around with the position of your camera and try different camera angles. So I might decide to try a couple other positions here on my landscape and see if I like them more. Perhaps something like this. I can bookmark this view then. And now I can come over to View, Bookmark. I can go back to my original position, or I can also compare it with this new position that I just created. We could add a number of bookmarks in our Maya scene here to the camera and try out lots of different camera positions. And with my camera set here, it may also make sense to work to the camera. So once again, I can come in here and use all of those different tools and techniques I was showing. For instance, I could come over to my mesh tools, once again, select my grab tool, and maybe really start fine-tuning this mountain ridge behind this canyon here to really create the landscape that I want to create for it. Maybe give this mountain range a little saddle here. And perhaps do something like that. Another tool that can be really useful under the Mesh Tools, Sculpting Tools, is the Smooth and the Relax tool. If I wish to smooth out some of these areas on this mesh, for example, by using the Smooth tool here, I can smooth out some of the more kind of, in this case, geometric looking squarish areas. Just soften them up a little bit. So after working on my landscape a little bit more, this is what I have so far. You can see how I've composed my scene where I know where the borders are. Just so that you can see what this is created from, I have two separate meshes here. one positioned behind the other one so that I can get some foreground, some midground, and some background in my composition here. Again, that's one of the great powers that we have as artists using this tool, is that we control what the viewer is seeing. So what you want to do is compose your landscape in the same way that that a photographer might, by being very conscientious about how you position your camera. But also, we can think a little bit like a Hollywood set designer, where we can also design our composition. We can design our landscape. So let's take a look at a few more things that we can do to push this landscape a little further. I'm going to select my camera. In this case, my camera that I created, that I'm going to be rendering to. I'll select it in my outliner here and go to the attribute editor. And in the attribute editor, I will find environment. Here in environment, I can change the background color to something, for instance, like a sky blue color like this. And then if I render using Maya software, I'll have a blue background. Or perhaps instead of this blue background, maybe we want to try a gradient. So to do that, I'll click on Image Plane, Create, and I'm not going to be using an image file. We'll try using an image file a little bit later. Instead, I'm going to change this to texture. And then in this field, texture, I'm going to click on this checkerboard and I'm going to choose ramp. Here's my ramp. Temporarily, I'll just make it change it from linear to none so that it's a little bit more apparent what colors we'll have here. I'm going to take a dark blue here, and we'll change this one to a lighter blue. And try rendering it out and see what we get here. So you can see how my ramp is working here. What I'll do now is change it from, what I'm looking at here is where this line is. I wanted to get an idea where that is. So you'll see that, for instance, if I move this a little to the right and then I render it out, that the line here will end up a little more up in the sky there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to switch it back from interpolation of none to linear so that we get this nice gradient, and maybe I'll take that blue color and saturate it a little bit more, maybe color shift it a little bit, and try rendering it out. And we'll just move it over a little more in this direction. Try it again. And as you can see, we start to get this gradient here. I just need to play around a little with the placement of it to get it right for my sky, and perhaps this looks good. Another technique that we can use for the background or sky in our landscape is to select the camera, go to the attribute editor, and once again, returning to environment, I will click on image plane, but this time we'll actually assign an image to this field here, the image name. You can see that the type is image file, so it's looking in this case for an image file. I'll click on this folder, navigate to where I have this image of some clouds, and I will open it up. And here we have our cloudy background, blue sky with clouds, and we can render it out, and we'll have the sky in our render as well. So what else can we do now to this landscape? Of course, we could apply textures to our landscape. I will be covering that, however, in a later video. We'll go over some techniques for creating those textures in the next video. So for now, I'm going to just assign some solid colors to my environmental objects here. I'm going to go to my hypershade. I'll create 2 new materials, and perhaps I'll call this one foreground matte. And I'll assign it a color. And I'll call this one background matte for material. And we'll assign that a color as well. In a previous video, I showed you how you could make your own custom tree or other plant using Maya's paint effects. I'm going to bring in one of my custom trees into this scene now. The first thing I'm going to want to do, however, is make this object, my landscape, paintable. So to do that, I'll select the landscape, go to Generate, and find where it says Make Paintable, right here. By making it paintable, I'll be painting my plants and other objects directly onto the landscape itself. Let's give that a try. Now, in an earlier video, I also showed you how you could save your paint effects strokes to a shelf, which is what I've done here. And that's how I'm going to access my tree now, is by clicking on the shelf button that I created. So what you'll notice is that I can paint in my environment now, and it'll actually place my trees in the environment. And if I hit play on my keyboard, you'll notice, if I hit play on the interface here, you'll notice that the trees are swaying in the wind here. Now for my landscape, I'm actually going to paint these trees closer into the foreground, so I'm going to delete that tree there, and I will paint one here in the foreground. And here is my tree. Now, I might want to position it a little, or maybe scale it down a little. So I'm going to go to the tree's global scale property here, and I think I'll try a little smaller number here. Perhaps something like that. And we'll check it out. Looks pretty good. I might want to reposition the camera a little bit. In addition, we can also, with the tree selected, try out some of the other seed properties here. So currently it's set to 2, but we can kind of cycle through this and see if we like any of the other trees better. Here's a good one. I think I liked 38. We'll go with that. So now that we have our tree in our landscape, perhaps I'll start populating the landscape with other paint effects, some of the presets that come standard with Maya. So let's take a look at some objects that we can use to maybe make the environment, our landscape, look a little richer. I'm going to go to Windows, General Editors, Content Browser. I'm already in the paint effects. Let's find some interesting ones. Some of these grasses could be nice, for example. Uh, let's see, which shall we try? Oh, perhaps I'll try, this grass carpet. This object is still paintable, this landscape, so I'll go ahead and just put some tufts of grass into my environment. Let's see if there's some other paint effects that might work out in our landscape here. So here in the plants mesh, there's some nice ones. Maybe I'll try some of these mushrooms here. And returning to the content browser, we'll look for a couple more things. Under Object Mesh, there's some uh, good candidates here for the environment. We've got these stones broken, stone pebbles, and I think there's one other in here that also might be useful. I'm not seeing it right now, but we'll go ahead and try the stones broken. And perhaps that's a little too, maybe too many, so I'll go ahead and just delete some of those. And let's go ahead and do a render and see how it looks. Something else that maybe could help fill out our landscape would be some trees, perhaps on this ridge off in the distance right here. I'm going to show you some trees that can work really well for that, that are in a sense very cheap because they're not going to be very costly as far as like rendering and polygon count and all that, but will still look really good from a distance. So I'm going to return to my content browser and I'm going to go to Trees Mesh, and we'll try this one here, the Pine Forest. And I'll put some of these pine trees over here on this far ridge. Now you're going to notice that these look a little bit different. If we take a look at them right now, they don't look very much like trees, but if we render it out, you'll notice that we have these pine trees in the distance. Let's take a closer look at these pine trees so that you can see what's happening with them. I'm going to, I'll select one of the clusters and then go to my perspective window, and we'll just take a look at them. Now, you'll notice that they do something very interesting. They're actually, if we look at it more from above, you'll see that they are more or less just polygon planes. But what they do is always face the camera. And this gives the illusion of the trees being three-dimensional. This is a very effective technique, especially for objects that are going to be off in the distance. This is a technique that can be used in games as well as in our Maya scenes. Let me return to our view here, and what I'm going to do is convert these clusters of pine trees here to polygon meshes. And I'm going to do that by going to Modify, Convert, Paint Effects to Polygons. And as always, I'm going to make sure that it's set to quad output, and I will apply. Now we don't see right now the trees, but that's because I need to press 6 on my keyboard so that we will have textures. And now you can see that, in fact, we've got our pine trees off in the distance. And if we render them, we'll have them as well. Now, the trees look good in the background, but there's something interesting that's going to happen if I hit play on the timeline here. So please take note of these trees here and watch what happens when I hit play. The trees have now disappeared. Let's take a look at how we can resolve that problem. So I've reverted back to an earlier version where I still have these pine trees before hitting play. I'm going to select them, and I'm going to go to Edit, Delete by Type, History. Now that I've deleted history on them, if I hit play, they remain there, and we still have our tree here swaying in the wind because I have not converted this one to a polygon mesh. Another thing that we can do to push this landscape further would be to create lights. So I'm going to go to Create Lights, and we'll try a directional light because that is the one that would be most similar to sunlight, because the rays of the light are parallel to one another rather than coning out like with the spotlight. So we'll go ahead and make a directional light. And I'm going to look through the light here. I'll go to Panel, look through Selected. That way I can a little more interactively position the way that the light is directed in the environment. And then in my camera view here, I will press 7. In fact, now that I've pressed 7 there, perhaps I'll play around a little bit more with the light and get the effect that I want. If I wanted to appear more like noon, maybe I would have the light rays come from above like this. If I wanted it to look more like dawn or dusk, I might bring the rays down to be lower on the horizon like this. Sometimes when rotating your lights, you may get some very strange angles, in which case I'll typically just reset them to 0 and then reposition. Another thing that we can do with our light is to enable shadows. In my viewport here, I'll go to Lighting, Shadows. What you'll notice is that currently these trees, which I converted to polygon objects, are casting shadows. This tree is not. That is because it is not a polygon object. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that if I render it, I'm still not going to have any shadows in my scene. All I have is shading. If I select the light, go to the attribute editor, I can turn on use depth map shadows. And by doing that, when I render, we'll start to get these shadows in the scene. Now, a couple things I can do to perhaps improve these shadows would be to adjust the resolution as well as the filter size here. I'm going to increase the resolution to 1024 and we'll try 3 for the filter size and render that out, see what we get. And perhaps that's a slight improvement. Another thing that I might do is I perhaps don't want these shadows to be as dark as they are. So I'm going to create an ambient light in my scene. This will brighten the scene considerably. So what I'll do is lower the intensity of that light. And then we can render that out and see how that looks. And I think that's looking a lot nicer because we still have our shadows and yet they're not completely dark. Ambient light fakes the idea that light is bouncing around in your environment. Another thing not to forget when working with lights is that you can, of course, increase or decrease the intensity of them. And you can also change the color of your light. I'm going to make my light a little more of a warm light. I don't want to go all the way to a really bright yellow like this, but a nice pale yellow like this can work well for a nice warm light. And maybe I'll take that ambient light and make it a cooler light, the one that is filling in the shadows. Now, our Paint Effect tree is not casting a shadow. Let's take a look at what we can do about that. So I'm going to select my tree, come over to the attribute editor, and go to Illumination. And we have a couple options here, couple options that might make it work a little better. Let's go ahead and do a render and we'll compare some of these settings here. So I've got my current render here. I'm going to go ahead and keep that render. And then I'm going to check Illuminated. And we'll go ahead and render that out and see if it makes a difference. And as you can see, if we look at the previous render and we look at this render, you'll see that this is actually accepting the lights and looks much more convincing. It's still not casting a shadow, however. We can also enable this fake shadow here, either 2D offset, you can see what that's doing there, not very convincing. Or we can also do the 3D cast. And that's looking a little better. I haven't actually tried playing around with these parameters before to see if I can get a better effect. Still not looking any better, but these might be worthwhile to explore and experiment with. What I'm going to do, however, is I'm going to say none for fake shadow. and I'm actually going to check cast shadows. And as you can see, this gives us a much better result. Now, one of the things I really like about these paint effect trees is being able to apply wind to it and then play it. And this would be a really nice way to present your landscape is by, instead of just rendering out a still image, perhaps rendering out a video. So that's a little bit about creating some landscapes in Maya. In the next video, we'll dive a little more deeply into some things that we can do with textures and materials. See you in the next video.